Good morning. My name is James Clarke, and I am a aspiring Unitarian Universalist chaplain. This morning I am here to speak with you about the theology of the infamous and notorious rock band Black Sabbath, widely credited as the fathers of heavy metal. Black Sabbath's iconic song, the one that many musicians and music critics alike agree essentially established the heavy metal genre, is the song Black Sabbath. This is a song that when they first played it inspired women to run away in fear, much to the surprise and disappointment of Ozzy Osbourne, who was under the impression that women were supposed to run towards rock stars, not away from them. What's particularly interesting about this song is that it actually features a chord progression known as the Devil's Interval. This progression is thus named because since at least the Middle Ages, it's been widely perceived as evil sounding. Essentially, if you're unfamiliar with the song, the progression goes something like this. Dum, dum, dum. Essentially, what makes this progression sound evil is the fact that it's basically a corruption of a power chord. If you're unfamiliar with music theory, this is a root, a fifth, and the octave. And this is also the chord that's in a lot of common rock bands like AC/DC loves power chords. Anyway, I digress. However, instead of having a root, an octave, and a fifth, the devil's tritone, or the devil's interval, has a root, an octave, and a diminished fifth, which is one step below a fifth. We intuitively feel that this third note in the sequence should resolve somewhere, but it doesn't. Instead, it leaves us in suspense. Some resolution that we were anticipating never comes. As listeners, we feel tension because we have an internal sense that this chord progression shouldn't stop where it does, and that its journey towards its seemingly natural destination has been abruptly and perhaps even unjustly thwarted. This sense of tension, disruption, and disappointment, the sense that something is somehow wrong with the universe, sets the tone, no pun intended, for Black Sabbath's theology. I know that this may come as a disappointment to some UUs, but Black Sabbath was not actually a satanic band. They were, in fact, basically a, quote, secret gospel band. These aren't my words. These are the words of Geezer Butler, who, if you're unfamiliar with Black Sabbath, is their bassist and principal lyricist. But if it's any consolation, as disappointed as you may be as a UU, Satanists were even more disappointed. Black Sabbath's lack of enthusiasm for black masses rubbed them the wrong way, resulting in several colorful incidents of harassment over the next few years. The crux of Black Sabbath theology, then, if you're not satanic and you're actually Christian, is that it involves an affirmation and recognition of the spiritual legitimacy of anger, darkness, and gloom. This theology is a response to optimism that, when encountered by people in tough situations, seems not only naive, but possibly even out of touch to the point of being hurtful. Such sentiments are not infrequently perceived as invalidating the dire experiences of people whose circumstances don't inspire hope and happiness. In psychology, this is often referred to as toxic positivity. In Black Sabbath's original context, hippie songs that affirmed the beauty of flowers, the inevitability of peace, and the universality of love, sung by people who could afford to be cheerful, didn't mesh with the experiences of people who worked dead-end, dangerous jobs in gang-ridden industrial cities like Birmingham. Also, of course, the idea that we can love ourselves out of the Vietnam War and Cold War seemed like an absurd fantasy. For people who were rich enough to avoid the draft or live far away from the target of a possible nuclear strike, the Cold War and the Vietnam War seemed like abstractions. For people who weren't rich enough to avoid the draft or live far away from the possible target of a possible nuclear strike, the Cold War and the Vietnam War were tangible threats. One might ask how one reconciles Black Sabbath's Christian influence with such a grim outlook. In truth, it's not actually as difficult as one might think. To throw down my nerd card here, there is a field of theological study called eschatology, which essentially involves examining end-of-the-world beliefs. Eschatology, by the way, if you're not a theologian, is one of those words where it is so difficult to pronounce, especially in its adjective form, eschatological, that it will literally make your mouth dry trying to say it, as it has mine. In the eschatological, did I say that right? I think I did. I apologize to my professors. In the eschatological sense, Black Sabbath's perspective is similar to those of to the eschatological. See, I can't even say it. I apologize, professors, for failing your class. The eschatological views of early Christians. Under the Roman Empire, there was essentially no middle class. You were either a 1%er or you were stuck in subsistence poverty. If you were a 99%er, there was very little reason to have any faith in peace or justice. Ergo, hope was a commodity. With this in mind, it was a common belief among denizens of the Roman Empire that the current world was ruled by some form of malevolent being. For proto-Christians, first century Jews, followers of Jesus, this malevolent being was the devil. And as such, there was a perception that the current world was evil. One sees this sentiment reflected in Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians, in which he shares his view that, quote, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers. We also see this view similarly expressed in the first epistle of John, in which the writer argues the whole world lies under the power of the evil one. The parallels between this view and Black Sabbath are reflected in many of their songs. For example, the song Wicked World starts off with the assertion that the world today is such a wicked thing. Their song, Lord of this world, similarly implies that the devil is said Lord. And as for the grim outlook, multiple songs by Black Sabbath, including War Pigs, Electric Funeral, Into the Void, and Season of the Dead, overtly affirm the very real possibility of human-driven global cataclysm. This is a cheerful thought, I'm sure, I know. If anybody's depressed now, I apologize to both you and your therapist. This may seem paradoxical, but despite being neither a Christian nor a cynic, Black Sabbath has actually had a huge influence on my theological perspective. Additionally, this perspective has had a huge influence on people around the world who love metal culture but are not themselves Christians. There are very devout affirmers of Black Sabbath worldview who are Muslim, who are humanist, who are Buddhist. And so, for me as a UU, it's not actually inconsistent with my faith to affirm the values and beliefs put forth by Black Sabbath. To help provide clarity here, writing in a British newspaper called the Church Times, Anglican vicar Reverend Rachel Mann argues that this theology can be understood as a, quote, liberative theology of darkness, in which darkness is understood not as a negative, but as a place of possibility. To this end, they note that in refusing to repress bleak and violent truths of human nature, metal culture demonstrates human honesty's liberative power. They further note that in showing this willingness to address nihilistic and potentially unpleasant subjects, metal culture also affords people a space in which they can be relaxed, fun, and accepting. To this, I would also add that metal culture invites people to be candid, even aggressively so. Reflecting back on my experiences growing up listening to Black Sabbath, I realized that listening to Black Sabbath made me realize that one can be religious without being dogmatic, intrusive, imposing, moralistic, puritanical, or sanctimonious. As a chaplain and as a UU, a line that particularly resonates with me and informs my approach to ministry is from this song, Under the Song, and it is as follows. I don't want no preacher telling me about the God in the sky. I don't want no one to tell me where I'm going to go when I die. For those of you who are chaplains, you will recognize these lines as consistent with the core professional standards for chaplains. One of the other things that has really resonated with me in Black Sabbath songs is that in cautioning people against ill-advised behavior, did you not heap condemnation on the misbehaviors? So, for example, there are songs called Hand of Doom, which condemns, which speaks out and discourages heroin use, but it also acknowledges that Puritanism and temperance are tied to socioeconomic privilege, and thus they avoid moral condemnation of those who lack such privilege. This, as a chaplain and as a UU, is a type of approach that we would do well to emulate. Black Sabbath, in being aggressive in their theology, is willing to sometimes do and say things that, as UUs, we may not necessarily always feel comfortable with. The song War Pigs specifically refers to generals and politicians as war pigs. To be fair, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was apparently okay with calling people pigs too, as he did when he said, quote, "Do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you." But again, such a prophetic language that Black Sabbath is affirming is not exclusive to Christian tradition. Throughout prophetic traditions and various religions, there are instances in which people have fervently drawn attention to wrongdoing, lamented the world's current state, and are unflatteringly disabused the powerful of their comfort. Going back to how I reconcile this with my UU faith, as a Unitarian Universalist, we covenant to affirm the worth and dignity of every person, and I don't dispute that. For me personally, I contend that affirming everybody's worth and dignity doesn't require us to validate people's entitlement to senses of privilege, senses of entitlement to privilege. And I disagree that affirming everyone's dignity obliges us to affirm their conceit, pride, and vanity. In the 1970s, Black Sabbath was forcing society to have a brutally honest conversation about a global existential threat that was worrying everybody at the time, that of nuclear war. While the imminent danger of nuclear apocalypse seems to have passed nowadays, or at least we hope, we are now faced with a new threat, that of global warming. As a recent HBO satire, Don't Look Up, sardonically illustrates, we need to have a serious global conversation about this threat. So where does that leave us? In my faith, I believe that the song Children of the Grave can provide us with a model for how to react to this existential threat. Children of the Grave explicitly calls for a revolution, but not an armed one. It encourages people to fight for peace, to fight the world until they won and love comes throwing through. Yes, this may seem like it is resonating with the hippie culture that they were speaking out against, but there's a paradox of aggression there, fighting for peace. It seems paradoxical, but it involves a moral imperative to be pushy and aggressive in fighting for justice and peace and for things that are right in the world. The world may look gloomy and hateful, Black Sabbath posits in the songs, but they suggest that it's on us to bravely show the world that love is still alive. Well, yes, again, Black Sabbath is willing to express their vehement dislike of seemingly piggish abuses of authority in songs like War Pigs. They are ultimately affirming the power of love in the greater sense of it, meaning agape, or love for your fellow human being. As a heavy metal enthusiast, I am delighted by widely confirmed data suggesting that heavy metal is the world's fastest growing musical genre. As somebody who has studied this genre and its musical culture extensively, I am very proud of the fact that metalheads have been significantly involved in revolutionary protests and social justice movements in countries like South Africa, Egypt, Hungary, and Indonesia. I hope that the prophetic, engaged, and conscious spirit within rock and metal songs can similarly inspire people around the world. Of course, this is not always easy. Going back to the prophetic tradition, for people who are familiar with Old Testament history, we know that Jeremiah was very angry, and he was very livid in denouncing the abusively powerful. He said things that were not always pleasant to hear. In fact, they were probably quite unpleasant. But they were based on legitimate truths. They were well informed. He was very aware of what was going on in society. And this, I feel, is a takeaway that both Jeremiah and heavy metal can teach us. And that is that our search for truth and meaning should inspire us to be perceptive to the messages of songs or to sermons or to speeches that may not necessarily sound pleasant, but are nonetheless important to hear. I hope, as a UU, that you, also as UUs, or maybe not, I don't discriminate, will be similarly open-minded to listening to the messages of songs like Black Sabbath and other bands. In the interim, I encourage you now to go now in peace. Ashe and amen, and whatever blessing is most convenient and accommodable for you.